Well, maybe, should I share my screen? And I kind of wanted to just kind of show you a couple of things I tried with the pulling in content things.
Yeah.
It shouldn't take too long, but just to kind of bounce those, put those out. Share screen. I can't remember. How does this work on?
Look on the, I don't know what you're using. Maybe bottom left, the 3 dots, or bottom right, the 3 dots.
I'm just in Chrome here. I don't see anything.
Let's see here. How do I do this?
Let me click on me. So you sharing your? Oh, okay, hold on. There it is. I think I found it. Yep.
Okay.
It was just hidden. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I wanted to sort of talk about this, this big issue here with the poorly tested doc.
Yeah.
An interesting thing. Okay, so I did some experiments. I'll want to show you those, and we can just talk about that a little bit. A couple of things I did in terms of experimenting with pulling in the code. And then, yeah, I guess the important thing to sort of distinguish here is that we are to some relatively high degree testing samples, testing the examples basically. We're using the docs. I know all of the ones in the traffic management, everything to do with the routing rules and all that, the book info, all that stuff. We've got tests for that, but I guess what we're trying to do here now is test the docs themselves and make sure the docs are up to date, because the tests are, it's testing the same functionality with a different program, and it's kind of reusing some of the same, config files and things, but exactly what the doc has, if it has embedded commands and stuff, those, get outdated, I guess, right? So that's the thing we're trying to test here.
Yes, embedded command lines and embedded mostly YAML, some JSON.
Yeah, so it's really more than just testing the samples used in the docs are showing, but to come up with a way that the docs themselves are then proved to be correct too by reusing same stuff.
Did you see the email I sent this morning? I wasn't sure I was using the right email address.
I did, actually. I just glanced at it. So yeah, that kind of follows on from my probably. Let's start by me showing the issues, and then yeah, I think you're sort of suggesting that maybe we need to. I think this is going to sort of suggest as well that we need to enhance the.
Yeah, because I looked at your PR yesterday, and it made me realize, my solution is definitely incomplete. It's not.
Yeah. I was actually, I got to say, I'm impressed with all of the fixes you've made in terms of, the rendering of text segments and stuff like that, because, all the stuff that you've been fixing lately, in terms of, the first lines, a command, and then the rest is out and stuff like that. That all just magically, perfectly worked with the, when I changed to one of these snippet things. So that was good, but here's the issue. Well, let me just show you quickly. So there's a couple of examples that I took. This was in the traffic routing, the traffic management egress task, basically. I just chose a couple of representative examples, I think, of some embedded text, right? Like this was an example of there's a bash segment that has a command on the first line with a $sign, and then there's a couple of lines of output, and basically the doc basically says, run this command and verify that you see this kind of, you're going to get this type of output. And then the other one was that I did here, a similar one. But this one was interesting in that, the entire text bash didn't show any output. It was just a command to run. But again, it was special in the sense that it's multi-line, but the first line was the command, and then we have this nice EOF kind of trick where all that becomes sort of recognized as part of the command. So anyway, both of these work. Like if you look at the preview output of this little PR, I'm pulling that from snip2 out of this test file, and I'm pulling this one out of snip1 of the test file, and it displays perfectly, so it works great.
But you just can't run a test against those things because the dollar signs are in there.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the snippets. So the snip1 up here. Oh, I see you commented already. So yeah, the first line is the source and then the output. So, the interesting thing is, this isn't really a proper command. You couldn't just have this, it's nice. You could have this in the bash script, in a script file, and then just run it, because, the snips are identified with comments and all that. But yeah, this $sign, well, there's two problems in this one. It's not just a command that you could run because there's extra $sign there, and more importantly, these are not commands; these are output from the command. So we sort of need to, somehow the test framework would have to massage this file. If we had this file before it could run it anyway, it would have to take off the $signs or remove outputs or some other way. And the second one, I guess the same problem is this one is almost fine, except for if there's an extra $sign. That if you just tried to bash this file with this in it, it would choke on the $sign. Before we just move on, the third thing I just wanted to show, which was kind of something that brings up a bigger question. This is in fact a class. One other thing that I noticed. So in the troubleshooting section of the op guide, I noticed, I just coincidentally caught this the same day. I said, "Oh, this is a classic example of the doc being out of date," because it basically was telling how do you verify that you've got a conflict with your your MTLS conflict in your system. And the command used to be just TLS check and give the name of the service you're calling, but recently it's been changed that you have to provide two arguments. The first argument is a pod. Well, it's kind of a weird syntax. It's a pod ID with an optional namespace, which is kind of the way to identify from which source. So again, to fix this example, I said, doesn't really matter. The Ingress gateway is as good as any. So I just said use the Ingress gateway as the source and then do it, and it still works. So this is a classic example of because of changes going on, Oh, hello. Sorry, was that Riggs?
Yes, that's me. Yeah. Sorry, I'm a bit late.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, can you hear me okay?
I can. Can you?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. So those hex numbers in there, that basically comes from a previous command that generated this, and then you use it here.
Yeah, exactly. It was just so it brings up a broader question now, right? So yeah, so previously you didn't need to give any identification of source, so there was just a command, and then I said, okay, now we need to fix the documentation. So let's just. So this is a classic example of the doc's broken, and we're trying to come up with a way to automate this so that the docs are always correct. But separate from that, what's the best way to fix this? If this was a proper kube CTL command, I would probably just change this to say label istio, -L istio equals Ingress gateway, right, or something like that, so that it's not specific. But how to fix this now, given that the user can't just cut and paste this anyway, is sort of a more general problem with what I've suggested fixing this with. So that's kind of almost a separate problem, but I'm not quite sure what the right way to do this is. So it's a classic example of this is just this is an example, not a cut and pastable command.
But is there a command above in the previous thing that where this thing is the output?
No. Basically, it shows the output just below. So basically, it's saying if you have, what this is describing is if you run into a case where you're calling a service and you set a destination rule and all of a sudden, you know, you're getting these 503s or something like that, it explains, oh yeah, a very common reason for this is that you've produced a TLS conflict. And then it basically talks about, you know, when you do your destination rule, make sure that you set the TLS, you know, the traffic policy to be match your you know, your system. If you're MTLS, it has to have the MTLS for the client, and then it just follows up and says, a way to confirm that this has happened is to just run this. And so this is both an example of saying, okay, the HTTP bin service is suddenly not working properly, and how can you check that there's a TLS conflict? And then you sort of saying, well, you know, so this is just an example command, yeah.
But so where does the user get this number from? Yeah,
so basically, you would now need to say, maybe this should say, you know, if, for example, your HTTP bin service, which had been working perfectly, now has an error, to check if it has a conflict, then you execute the command, the one in pink, which is what you used to have to do. But now you'd have to say, and you know, and the first argument is the pod ID of your Ingress gateway, you know, .istio system, you know.
Yeah,
I mean, it's kind of a pain. This has become harder to document for sure.
I also look on the first line, I guess that'd be line 81 above. It says field in the output O. Is that correct? Maybe that's
no, I think it's. I think that's just the diff thing.
Oh.
So, Frank, part of the issue here, and I think that's what Martin is trying to explain, is that the information that you have in that field, it's not information that is easy for the reader to obtain, right?
And it's not even, yeah, so it's definitely not a command that you can just cut and paste and run.
Yes.
It's something that's just kind of saying, run a command like this one. In fact, I think it says, you know, run it. It says that, for example, to say, run a command similar to the following, passing in your Ingress gateway's pod ID and the name of the service that you're running.
Okay, so imagine if the pattern was instead of putting these hex numbers, you put just something like bracket pod ID bracket, and then you explain how to get this pod ID in words. And then as part of the test infrastructure, we recognize that similar annotation and say, okay, that you can evaluate an equivalent of a printf on this to replace the bracket with an actual pod ID.
Yeah, you could say in some kind of nice syntax that this is the pod ID of your Ingress gateway.
Yeah.
But the dot part is also the you know, variable too. It's the istio system namespace.
Yeah, so you need to have we need to have a little EBNF kind of syntax there. Pod ID dot namespace, and then during the test infrastructure, we'd replace this with actual values.
Yeah.
But to Frank's point, this is just an example. This is something that you can find in a lot of places in the docs.
Yeah, I think you'll find, you know, this is not the most common. 90% of our stuff doesn't fall into this category where the actual arguments are something that won't work unless you fill them in with correct stuff. So this is a smaller problem, but it is a problem. I would definitely say this is sort of maybe the next level of issues to deal with, but because it's just an example of here's how I would look at the, you know, in my system, you know, this is how I can do this TLS check. And then the important thing to look at is the output just below, right on line 87. Like if you see the status field says conflict, that's kind of what this is trying to say. That, and basically the output here is saying that the HTTP service, you know, on the left there, the column is in a conflict status because the client is HTTP and the server is MTLS.
Yeah.
So that's really just a simple example.
And it's true that it's just a small minority of commands that fall under this category, but it's a small percentage that blocks automation for testing.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So anyway,
Okay, so I think this clearly shows that the raw concept of just pulling out snippets is insufficient to get a testable system.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think that's the bottom line. You definitely need to do some kind of modification to the test framework, or both the the snippet stuff and in some way that you can
But,
separate commands from command output, and basically get the $ thing, so we still get the magic of cut and paste. That you don't want to lose that, right? That's a really nice feature.
Okay, so do you want to bring up the doc I sent this morning then?
Sure, if I can find it. Yeah, I think.
But wait, before we move on, to Martin's point earlier, it's not only that you need to change the command, you also need to change the text. Because if you put the label there saying pod ID, you need to tell readers how to get that pod ID in the text. So it's a combination of things that we need to do in tandem to get it.
Here's the thing, though, like this in this op guide, this is just a short little blurb about a potential problem you might be running into. When I wrote it initially, I didn't think it was anything that anybody actually would want to run. It's just showing them they would run it with their own service, whatever service. Basically, the text says, if you have a service, and I'm just showing, oh, it's the HTTP one. But if your service isn't working, a way to check is to do this Istio thing and give your service name, basically, and see if it produces an error message with a conflict in it. So it's not really a command that we want you to try. You know what I mean? So I'm having a hard time.
But I think instead of putting sample service names, I'd rather see bracket service name, and then an explanation down below, just one sentence that says service name is the name of your service, or pod IP, acquire the pod IP this way, or something like that.
Well, actually, again, that's where the Istio control authn TLS check command gives you the arguments. So maybe, yeah, you're right. This could just be as simple as, this could just say some source and some service, my service, or some source and my service. And then down here, it would just say some source, just fake, right? But then the important things is the conflict and what's the definition.
So there's a couple things we could do in the UI to make this better. So if you have bracket parameters, so called out service name parameters and stuff, we could make it so either the block doesn't cut and paste in the standard way because you can't paste it and use it. That probably is too much. You could make it so when you hit copy, it's going to ask you to replace type in service name, and it's going to provide you generate a clip that's actually useful to you.
That would be the Cadillac solution. I would think just copy something that has little placeholders that are obvious, and then they can just.
Yeah, that's all enough. So the other idea is, the pop-up glossary thing that I added, right?
Yeah.
The word.
Yeah.
We could have standard when you have a sequence that's pod IP, pod ID. You hover over that, and then there's a little pop-up that explains what that is, so you don't need to repeat it 50 times in the docs. Right?
That might be nice, yeah.
I think that's a very good solution for the things that are like pod ID, where you need to provide instructions on how to get that. That's definitely something worth considering.
And that's good. Now that I know how to do it, that's pretty easy.
Yeah, the one thing that I think we really should sort of try to understand and make clear is there are two different categories of commands in the docs. The ones that are part of a recipe, that a task, an example, whatever it is, where it's a recipe that says, here, run these things to go through and prove something, versus just an example command. Just an example of to show you what you're looking for in the output, and I think we should separate those two things, and they probably, like you said, should not be sort of something like if it's the latter type, we probably don't really want real things, but for the other ones, obviously, we do.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so this morning, what got me up so early and sent you this email was because I was thinking about this, and thinking, man, it's embarrassing that I thought this was a sufficient solution, and clearly it's not.
Yeah, there's a few glitches. Well, that's the funny thing when you said it, and they said, "Oh, okay, I didn't know that would do this, but let me try it on like the first 3 things I did." I said none of these worked, right?
Yeah. So okay. So what I said this morning, I think would work. So if you want to just bring up if you've got the email, or I can present it.
Yeah, let me stop sharing and you present it because I have to dig it out now. I can't remember.
So basically, the idea is we have a standard test framework that we're deploying everywhere. So I'm suggesting we do an extension of this test framework, specifically targeting creating sample tests or tests for samples that integrate well with the doc system. So let me bring this up. This. All right. Okay, so the idea is, so since most of our stuff is about running command lines effectively, so this says you'd be writing a regular an integration test. So there's some stuff that's not shown here that is involved in setting up an integration test. But once the test is set up, then you create a sandbox, which perhaps is a bad name, but maybe it's just creating an example at this point. But it just says, okay, this is a self-contained thing that I'm starting, and it's got a name, and then you just proceed with a bunch of imperative operations over that thing you've created. You can define some command lines.
Does this thing have a one-to-one correspondence with the name of some task, for example? So like the egress task would be what this is.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Right. So you put the egress task as the name. Then you say, okay, I'm going to give you a batch of commands to run, and the output of these commands is text or YAML or JSON or whatever. After that, you can add an arbitrary number of these command lines. So that represents, so you can have 3 command lines and 1 output, just like you have in the doc. So there's always an arbitrary number of command lines and a chunk of output. But you can add command lines many times if your test requires you to run many batches of commands. And then you can take files in raw form and say, okay, I'd like to add this to my sandbox. And then you execute the, what's this? Okay. So this exact thing, the intent here is that when the test actually runs and these command lines are running and the environment is set up in a particular state, so you've decided to add a virtual service using kubectl, and the test has been run, so the virtual service is created. Now it's going to call this execute method, which is where you can actually test that the virtual service actually was created, works the way you think it does, using regular Go logic. Okay, so you've added these things to the sandbox, and then at the end you say run. So it's going to run the command lines, capture their output, invoke your test hook to actually make sure the test is reliable. And then the last thing that it does is outputs a number of files. So example name is the name you gave when you created the thing. Snippet 1 represents the command line, the first batch of command lines. So in this case, it would contain kubectl XYZ and kubectl ABC. Snippet 1 text is the output, the standard out that was produced by running this, and it's .txt because you said text output, but it could be .yaml and .json. And then finally, it just got the myfile.yaml that was added over here. So you write your examples in this pattern. You run them as tests, and the output you're going to get is going to be a bunch of these directories. Each directory contains all the snippets related to this example, and then this gets consumed by the website, and we can produce the web content using the same snippet model well, actually, I guess you don't need snippets. You don't need the snippet annotations at this point. They're all full files that you can just inject into the website. They're fully tested, and it just works.
So and what? Yeah. So what? What's the correlation in terms of builds and what's going into the website then in terms of these snippet files?
Well, so you would basically we'd have a nightly job or something like that that runs all these tests, extracts and produces this this output directory, and that we would just either check into the doc repo, kind of like we do with the reference material, and then when you crank the docs, it would pick up this set of updates, and it would just be in the doc set. So actually, it probably would work just like the reference material. So once in a while, we run a script that triggers all these tests to run to collect the output of all these tests and move them over to the doc repo.
Martin, a couple of questions. So, for example, if a task has several sets of commands, you would have a snippet for each set of command and their output, correct?
Correct. So you'd be calling add command lines for each separate, what is currently a text block. So for each separate text block, you say these are the command lines that produces one file or one set of files, and then you can have many of those into a single test.
So these are only text bash type things, or do we have this? Does this have to apply for other things too, like text YAML things and? Or
well, that's basically so. Ultimately, if you have if the only thing your markdown contains is a chunk of YAML, and you don't have a description of the command lines you need to run, then I think you can leverage the same infrastructure, except no, that's right. You leverage the same infrastructure. So you say, okay, I have a chunk of YAML. Here's the kubectl I need to actually use this chunk of YAML, and here's a little piece of code, of Go code, that checks that the effect of the kubectl is correct. So you write it in this style. It's going to produce these different files, but in the website, you don't need to consume all the snippets, right? If you don't care to show the command line, you can just consume the YAML file and put that in the docs.
Yeah. I guess the real thing is, the goal here is to make sure that anything we're documenting that says run this command or do this thing, it's going to work. Now, if we're just giving a little example of a YAML fragment, it's kind of more like the same as an example of just some text that's now being obsoleted by some tweak in the design, and that's going to be a different problem. It's not really a test related fix anymore. Yeah, you know what I mean?
In theory, there'd be a lot fewer of those. It's a little more manageable.
I think if we even just sort of think of this, the places that there's currently text bash things, commands with associated stuff and output, those we want to confirm that the command hasn't changed or that the YAML is correct and that it will work. This isn't 100% going to fix our problems anyway, because it's such a moving target in terms of just confirming that the docs are telling you the right way to do things is another problem, right?
Yeah, so this does not fix the pros.
Yeah.
No. Okay, so now that we talk about this, there's another thing that this does not address, and that's all the YAML that's in the Istio API repo. There's a lot of sample YAML that's in the proto comments that's not tested in any way. So we need a solution that works for that as well somehow.
That stuff people are less likely to cut and paste, I think. It's more just, well, maybe not. But
it's also that area.
Yeah. Well, I know for the longest time you've been advocating for moving all that stuff out of the APIs anyway. Like when it's things with big examples and stuff, it doesn't fit that well there anyway, but it's a bigger issue. And I know Sriram was sort of pushing back on that. But anyway, yeah. Well, I think the other problem this doesn't address that I think we've been having a lot of, but maybe it'll get less as Istio stabilizes, is that just the design of Istio is improving in ways that the way we told people to do stuff is a stupid way to do it in the latest release, but the doc doesn't get updated. So even like, you're saying, how do I do A or B? And you go, yeah, do this ridiculous thing, even though now they say, well, you don't have to do any of that anymore, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how to address that either.
I think this is a great tool, and it gives us a starting point. I agree with you, Frank, that it won't solve all the technical accuracy issues that are possible, but it does help a lot with those issues, those technical accuracy issues that just happen because the command change or the parameters change, and we really don't have a efficient way to detect them automatically. We only learn about them when someone complains that the command stopped working.
Well,
and that's not ideal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's one thing. Even if the prose is out of date, if the commands that's shown are working, that's enough to get a lot of people through the problems.
Yeah.
Right now, if the prose is out of date and the example's out of date,
yeah.
Well, anyway, it's definitely it's a challenge to keep this stuff correct. But anyway, so I'm wondering. Here are sort of the cons of this whole automatic getting the doc like this. I don't know if they're big enough to say that it's a showstopper in any way. It's just, but I did notice a few things that are not so nice about when you do this. One is just it's the same problem we've been having just with all the fancy stuff the website does for you automatically. It makes it way harder to review PRs. Because now you've got this, if somebody makes a PR, has a PR with some stuff in it that's showing you things, you cannot see any of it, right? It's all coming from these magical include statements that you have to just assume. So I think we have a harder time validating that even at day one the thing was correct, let alone that it's that the commands all work.
So the pattern you'd have here is you'd be typically reviewing the samples in this as a sample PR.
Yeah.
And then when you're reviewing the doc PR, you'd see the snippet files eventually. So you could go look and say, okay, there's these 3 commands. This is the output. These 4 commands. This is the output. So it's not a great experience, but it's
and as a reviewer, to Frank's point, it's very time consuming because you have to jump from the documentation repo to the samples repo, take a look there, which is why I was working with the local build when I was doing the restructure, because it's just generating the rendering, it resolves all the includes, and then you can look at the output as a reviewer and see what actually is going to be included and how. So maybe a solution for that is just to make our manual build or our local build of the docs very clear and very easy to use, so that reviewers can just render the PR and review it there.
Yeah, I agree, because you brought up the point that it got a lot harder to review PRs as soon as we had to sort of go and look at the preview. You have to keep switching back and forth. Well, sometimes not, but certainly a lot of times when you're trying to review carefully somebody's PR that's got a lot of technical stuff, and you have to understand what the fragments all are doing, the little text sec. You kind of have to go and read the preview and then kind of go find it back in the thing to put your comment in the right place and things like that. So that got harder. And I think, Riggs, what you're suggesting is let's not get any harder than that. That's kind of as far as I'm concerned, we're right there at that point where, tipping point. If you go further, it's even getting ridiculously difficult. But if we can somehow keep it at that level, that's not too bad.
So I've started to write some bots that integrate with GitHub as part of CodeMob. So I understand how to read issues, read PRs, and inject stuff in the issues and PRs. I could actually make it so, the preview link that we get right now for a website just points you to the root of the whole website, and you have to go find which example am I supposed to look at.
Yeah, that's tricky too, because you have to sort of go back to the PR and try to find what was the title of this again.
Yeah, and the titles of the files doesn't necessarily match the names you see in the UI. Yeah. So I could actually have a bot that looks at the files that are changed, finds them in the website, and then injects a link directly to that into the PR.
That would be very useful, yes.
Yeah, if that's low-hanging fruit, that would be really helpful, yeah.
That would probably take just that's like 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
Martin, another question I had regarding this testing is, how would it work for content that we want tested, but that originates not as a sample, but as a task? So let's say someone writes a task, they have their snippets. How do you see the commands that they write on that task getting into a test of this form?
No, that's exactly what I was thinking of for this. Right, so you don't need. So the way our test infrastructure works is you just have a bunch of test functions. Depending on which components, you can have dozens of these different test functions. So now you just write a test function for your task. And okay, my task requires these 5 kubectls, and I want to display the output, and here's a YAML file that goes with it.
I'm thinking from a contributor perspective. Let's say I am someone that wants to write a new task. Are we going to ask a new contributor that's writing a new task to go write the test for their task?
That's how it would, yeah.
Okay.
The test is sort of the first prereq for a new task, or example, I guess, but maybe not blogs. Blogs, that would be horrendous.
Yeah, I think that's very important that we make that distinction very clear to contributors, and that we include that as part of the process, and say, hey, if you want to submit a task or a tutorial, you need to start with the test. Have your commands there, and then we can move to the pros. I'm okay with it, but it's a process that we need to define and publicize very clearly. Because a lot of DPEs, in our case, or just people that go to conferences, they write these tasks or these blogs for conferences or as demos, and they have the text and the commands in that form. And what if we go that path, what we're literally saying is, okay, you now have to extract yourself the commands from that demo or that task and put them in this test format. And I was wondering if there was maybe a way we could provide them with a tool that would generate the test from the code blocks that they have on their tasks.
Oh, going the other way?
Going the other way, yeah.
Write an actual document and have it kind of go in and produce a reproducible test. But you could do something. You could do something more like a simulate a user rather than writing a separate program in Go. That's more like somehow coming up with a script that goes and extracts the commands out of the doc and writes a script that just does a bunch of bash commands and confirms everything's working correctly.
Well, the problem is you need to make an environment for these things.
Yeah.
It needs to be in kubectl, or sometimes there's a thing saying, hey, before you do these steps, you need to go look over here and do these 5 prior steps before you do anything.
Before you begin has a lot of setup stuff, so the environment has to be right, and it's not easy.
But we could standardize it before we begin for tasks depending on the area. Let's say we could have a before you begin for traffic management, and then have an environment for testing traffic management tasks.
Hold on, I don't really want to go in that direction.
Okay.
Writing, I don't want to write software as comments in a document. It's a terrible editing experience. The round tripping as you're trying to get this working would be just exasperating. I would rather go over here and say, for example, I think this could be improved here. I just realized instead of having the command lines here, in your test directory, you could have little script files. Right? Here's the first script, here's the second script you need to run, here's the third script you need to run. That would provide a better editing experience for everybody all around. The tests are just in the directory. I can run them if I run the script files. The YAML files are there. And the only thing the infrastructure does is it orchestrates running the script, getting the output, running the script, getting the output, and making sure it makes its way to the doc website.
Yeah, I think that also solves the problem I was wondering about. If these commands, what happens when you have the kind that is a bunch of lines of YAML with the EOF thing also formatted? So having that just in a separate file makes more sense, right?
And you can have a separate file for each block of commands in a task or a tutorial.
Exactly. So you have a bunch of these script files. If you're at the command line, you can just run them. You can run them in the sample repo. You can copy them from the sample repo, and the doc will be able to extract it and put it piecemeal into separate text blocks. That's a pretty reasonable story, I think.
And for simple tasks, you would have a simple one-file script, and for more complicated tasks, you could have multiple scripts. So yeah, I think that would scale pretty nicely.
So if there's ways that you can test, so if you do a kubectl to add a virtual service, if there's a way you can test that virtual service is properly created strictly through the command line, fine, you write some scripts to do some script logic to do that. If you need some Go code to actually validate that what you did is working correctly, then you put it in this file instead, right? And then so fine, the script creates virtual service X. I'm going to actually try and route traffic through virtual service X.
Most of the tests that we have, most of the tasks, basically, the way the user confirms it worked is you're supposed to see this output kind of thing. And that's how, the nice thing about this, we could try this out. Like, there's a whole bunch of tasks that we still would have to write tests for. But like the classic book info ones, the ones that show how to do routing and how to do, add a timeout and things like that. All those ones, we already have a test case that's running that exact same thing, just in a different program. So that, if we had this framework to just restructure that to use this instead, the tests already exist, just retweak it. And so we have an existing test that just needs to be rewritten in this framework. Then we could see if we can rewrite the task now to just pull all the fragments in, and that would be a proof of concept for. And then there's ones that we still have to write a test from scratch, and then there'll be new challenges. But the question is, I don't know, how hard would it be to build a test framework like this, or did you hear?
Building this would be pretty simple. Given the existing test framework we have that creates the environments and runs all this stuff, I think we have all the pieces.
It's just the running the test part that's changing. Like the whole setup of the whole test framework is unchanged. Yeah.
Exactly. So Oz wrote the test framework. So he just left some comments in the docs here. I was going to sit down with him and kind of figure out what's the best way to integrate this into the framework. It's a trivial amount of logic once we know where it's supposed to go.
Martin, one question I have is how would we indicate in the doc that a particular snippet needs to be put in a specific place? Like, let's say I have a task in my Markdown file. Will I have a short code or something telling in the Markdown saying, go to this snippet and get the code block from here?
Yeah, so that already exists.
Okay.
Essentially, the example I was showing, right?
Okay.
We would have a file, and I guess we would come up with some nice convention for these that's well known now. So it'd be, the example 3 or whatever in the thing would be snippet number 3 or whatever, and within example with the name, so that the file name and all that would be well known.
So a couple of things are, we need a consistent naming convention for those snippets so that we can have it in our contribution guideline saying, when you add the snippets from these test words, do it with this naming convention so that we are all using the same naming convention and it's easier to review.
So the test framework already has a naming convention. So I would say the best thing is just to use that convention there.
Sure.
And then so the syntax that we have today is this text import thing. It works just like a text block, except you give it a file, and then you can specify the syntax, and it'll just pull it in statically. And you can also give it a URL instead, and it'll pull the content dynamically as the page is being rendered. So this is done statically when the site is produced, and this is done dynamically when the page is loaded.
I understand that syntax. As I was talking about naming conventions for a snippet _ example.txt.
Yeah.
So that,
let's say the egress task, that the third little command that it runs inside of the egress task, but you might move them around too. That's in the doc. That's the other point. So it comes down to the test. We're going to have a little. Are they numbered? Sort of like if it's the third little fragment. It's the third test we're running inside of the egress test case, basically, which is going to be the egress task ultimately. Do we have a convention, or is there some that we have to name each test and then use those names in in the document? I guess instead of snippet 1, it would be snippet egress. Example of MTLS or something.
Yeah, so I think the test names are supposed to be globally unique, and you don't need directories. It's just a globally unique symbol. So we could just use that there for the test as well, from the doc side. Just name that test /1, /2, /3, or whatever to get the different pieces of it.
And I'm also wondering, because some tasks use the same code block in different places. So there will be some reuse of those snippets as well, even within the same task. So to the numbering, it can be confusing for reviewers if they go and look and see a task where a snippet 2 is used after a snippet 7. If we don't give them any guidance that, oh, this is because we are reusing a snippet 2 because this is a different part of the task, and you need to do this specific command yet again.
Okay, so that means then the snippets themselves should have semantic names instead of just numbers.
That's what I was trying to get to, that sometimes numbers can be confusing too.
Okay, so it sounds as though we think there's potential in this kind of model. So let me do a second pass over it and turn it into an official Istio document there. And then maybe we can talk about it or iterate over it over email. I can kind of make an estimate of how hard this would be to implement as well.
Okay.
All right, good. Well, I'm glad I got up early for a good reason.
A quick update on the restructure. The restructure of the website, the larger one. Let me present my screen so I can show you. So the larger one is done. Thanks, Martin, for merging it. You can see it on the preliminary site.
Are you presenting? I don't see it yet.
Let me.
I think I looked at it already though. Like the last thing I saw is you've moved the FAQ. Everything's all kind of nice now. The op guide is down in docs.
So you can see my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, just like you were saying. So the FAQ is now its own section. Docs has the operations guide, and the glossary is under reference.
I sort of wonder, just is the the FAQ maybe should just be under docs too, and like, where is it usually on a website? Like, is that?
There's a lot of places where it's actually in the header.
Because we also have frequently asked questions in the op guide, didn't we? Or is that being removed?
No, we don't have one. We don't have it.
Did there used to be? Because I kind of.
Well, yeah. At some point, TreeRAM created a bunch of FAQs in all the different subdirectories.
Yeah.
And we ended up consolidating.
Okay, so there's only the one.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess that. I don't know. It was just sort of a instinct that did that look right up there or not. Maybe it should be at the end of the list of things. Like the doc, I'm talking about the top right corner. What are the key things? Doc, even blog. I don't know what are sort of in terms of order of most importance. And one other thing I was just, before I forget to mention, is the search thing. I wonder if the search thing should always show the box there, because I kind of forget it's there, and it's really useful.
Yeah, we could do that now. And so some of it is part of my learning process. right, the website has very different layouts depending on the size of the screen.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was having a lot of trouble with that. Now I understand how that's supposed to work. So we could make it so in the regular layout, that
Regular desktop.
it's shown, and in the smaller sizes it's not. I could do that.
Yeah, it wouldn't be bad because and the other thing about the search thing, usually your last search kind of stays there, but it doesn't here, right? Like you type something in and then go and then come and type something in again. Well, maybe, I don't know.
So maybe I can set that up, keep that with a cookie. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's difficult because that text box is special. So right, we're using Google custom search, and they control this text box, and there's limited stuff I can do to it. Like I'm already playing dirty tricks to make it look the way it does instead of the standard way. Like if you go, can you make the window small again?
Yes.
And then click on the hamburger, and oh, it doesn't show it. So yeah, so sometimes in certain cases you'll see it'll say Google custom search in the.
Here's a summary from.
No, I didn't talk to you. Yeah, so sometimes you'll see the Google logo and say custom search. I think it's if the text box is displayed without being activated. That's what it shows by default. Anyway, if you want to,
it's really good. Like, don't get me wrong, this is like really nice. But yeah, the search thing, I don't think it was doing. I just saw Riggs when you clicked on the search thing. It was kind of and started typing. It was showing you history stuff, right? I don't think it was working for me on Firefox. Maybe something was weird, but.
Oh yeah. Okay, yes, that does show normally.
Yeah, so it didn't do that for me before, but maybe.
Maybe because you were on Firefox and you had a plugin or something. Yeah. Because I'm on Chrome.
Anyway, that addresses the issue. But I'd say if that search box should just be there all the time on sort of the large desktop thing, because then it really reminds you. Oh, otherwise you kind of forget. Oh yeah, there's this little thing I can search up there, and you're looking around. Oh, what's this thing again?
So for it to be displayed all the time, it means I have to shift all these other icons, all this other stuff sideways.
Yeah, but you got a lot of space on the desktop for sure.
Yeah, on the desktop it should fit. Yeah.
Doesn't have to be huge, but enough that yeah. Anyway, that's just maybe you should ask other people too. That was just my instinct that would have been great if I would have just seen that there. I would have used it way more often than I do because it just reminds you that you can search rather than search manually.
Yeah, I'm not a designer, but doing this website, what I was striving for was kind of a lightness and not make it busy. So I tried to keep the colors uniform and the minimal ornamentation. So part of that was kind of hiding some stuff that you don't necessarily need, but that can't trump usability. Okay, so I'll put that on my list.
Yeah, we can take it offline because I do think that it's probably good to make the search more visible. I agree with Frank. It's extremely useful. I use it all the time when people ask me, hey, do we have content around this or that? Usually, with a simple search, I can find the content they were looking for.
But I suspect it would constantly say Google custom search. So I don't. I'm trying to make this so this Google doesn't show up anywhere. This is not Google related. It's Istio, and if it says so on every freaking web page, that's that worries me.
No, absolutely right. Okay.
Anyway, we're just about out of time here. I just very quickly. I don't know if I've shared my screen again. Just one more minute. I don't think we're going to get through all the stuff we want to talk about today, but just to. So it sounds like we've got a plan to sort of at least continue pursuing this moving the code out thing. We have to talk about this samples directory and samples repo. I saw Kuat had some serious concerns, and I kind of respect his opinion. So I don't think maybe it's not a good idea. So we should talk about that, but maybe we can do that next week. Okay. Yeah, Riggs, you showed the thing that's Yeah, and this other thing is this blog post. Should we really somehow in the document of providing documents say that a blog post exactly define it, be very clear that versus a task, an example, it's a one-time thing. Don't expect to update it. You know, I think we did update some blogs, but that's because in the early days, Istio had fundamental breaking changes like into the networking model. So we went and updated all those blogs, but we don't want to be saying, oh, every time a new better way of doing something comes along, we just go and update an existing blog. A blog should just be, that's done. We write a new blog and say, you know, following up on a previous blog, and you can point to it and then say, here's a new one. So should we document this in the...
It's already documented in the content types. I can make it more prominent and rewrite it so that it's maybe more emphasized.
And does it emphasize these 2 points that I'm showing here? This, you know, that really it's a one-time thing. Don't plan on updating it. That's rare. And also, you know, when a better way to do something comes along, you should write a new blog and reference this blog. That's sort of the recommended way. That's the difference between blogs and tasks or examples. And we still have a discussion on, you know, tasks versus examples that we haven't completely resolved. But I think the blog one we can take off the table if we can agree on that.
The first one, I'm sure we already addressed. The second one, we don't. So I can take that AR and make sure that both those things are very clear in our content type, and also write a blog post announcing the change and making it clear so that folks know this is the way we are going to be doing blog posts moving forward.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I think last week we also talked about blogs. We have to figure out a way to sort of publish those more quickly to Istio.io instead of preliminary. But then I think the blog issue goes away, and we don't have to worry too much about you know, any of these other issues with blogs. They're a separate beat.
All right, I gotta run.
Okay. Yes, same with me. Okay, so thank you guys, and so it sounds like we're making progress.
Great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.